Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. I'm your host, J. Stephen Roberts, and we have with us today one of our usual guests, Dr. Stephen Donnachie, eminent Crusades historian who has been with us many times to share some of his knowledge. And we are going to be hitting a topic that I guess in some ways is pretty timely for our podcast, since not too long ago we finished a rather extensive examination of the Third Crusade. Really what we're going to be talking about today is the post-Third Crusade Kingdom of Jerusalem, or Kingdom of Acre, if you will, Outremer, following the Third Crusade, and especially following the changes that came about as a result of the conquests of Saladin in 1187-1188, following the Battle of Hattin. So I have to say, this is a really fascinating topic to me. But Dr. Donnachie, first of all, I just want to say welcome to you. Thanks for coming again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and I find this topic really fascinating just because I think it's sort of rarely examined. The portion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem that seems to be most looked at is that 12th century period, probably, from the First Crusade really to the Third Crusade, kind of the period covered by Malcolm Barber's recent book, which was entitled The Crusader States, although it did just cover that period, from the First Crusade to the Third Crusade. So our first point here is really the Battle of Hattin itself. Obviously, Hattin, it was the most important defeat of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem up until that point. It had major implications, the fall of Jerusalem itself, the fall of the entire coast. Almost the entire kingdom really was taken over by Saladin, except for Tyre and a couple of castles. The Third Crusade shows up not too long after and stabilizes the situation. It does a lot to restore and reverse what Saladin had done. Acre is restored. A lot of these important coastal cities are restored. And a new portion is added to the kingdom, Cyprus. So in the wake of the Third Crusade, we have sort of this new Crusader kingdom, this Kingdom of Acre, as it's sometimes called. And I actually prefer to call it that just because, Jerusalem isn't included for most of this period. There was this recovery, too, that happened. After the Battle of Hattin, how did the kingdom recover? What were the implications militarily? What were the long-term effects of Hattin? That sort of thing. Why don't you talk to us about that, Dr. Donnachie?
Well, how does the kingdom recover from Hattin? Certainly in military context. Hattin is this absolute disaster, where the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is all but destroyed in this decisive engagement. But I think the roots of the kingdom's immediate recovery actually lie in the post-Hattin period, before the arrival of the Third Crusade. We have this narrative, this kind of decline and fall narrative that the Kingdom of Jerusalem builds up over the course of the 12th century, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, and Guy de Lusignan, and internal rivalries within the kingdom. And then you have the rise of Saladin. You have this great battle, and everything is shattered. And then, fortunately, your convenient heroes of Richard the Lionheart and others turn up and save everything, and put some things to right, and then head off. I actually think the kingdom is largely saved before the arrival of people like Philip II or Richard the Lionheart or these Crusaders. I actually think, from what the source material suggests, is that we've probably underrated the kingdom in its post-Hattin period because everything seems to be like a disaster. But actually, I think more knights survive the battle and escape and flee to places of safety than we might initially give it credit for. That the kingdom, despite this terrible battle, and it is a terrible battle, the military orders are killed and executed after the battle, and they account for sort of 50% of the army of these 1,300 knights that march out to Hattin. They make up about 600 or so. But there are a lot of survivors from the battle who turn up in the source material in this 2-3 year period, or between summer of 1187 to the autumn and winter of 1189, who were at the battle but have survived, and Bélin of Ibelin being quite famous amongst them. Obviously, they goes on to defend Jerusalem. But there's lots and lots of others there as well. There's Reynald of Sidon. There's Jocelyn III of Edessa. There's Raymond III of Tripoli and his 4 stepsons, the 4 Tiberius brothers. And lots more. There's the Viscount of Nazareth turns up, and there's quite a lot. Walter II of Caesarea, as I recall, Pagan of Haifa. They all turn up in Tyre, in the cities of the coast, in the castles and fortifications of the kingdom, in this post-Hattin period. And some of them have been in the rear guard of the army, and as we discussed on numerous occasions about the fighting march, down the coast and to Hattin, things like that, the rear guard makes up one of the most important parts of the army because it's one that's frequently put under pressure by raiding and harassing and skirmishing by their Muslim opponents. So I think that though Guy de Lusignan and many others are actually captured the battle and the military orders are executed and removed as a military factor, more escape and make it to the coast or the castles than we might think. I mean, Guy de Lusignan in 1189, after he's been released, marches on Acre with an army that, according to sources, is 600 or 700 knights in total. But the only substantial forces that had arrived thus far in the Latin East are several hundred knights from Sicily and Guy's own brother Geoffrey de Lusignan with some of the first elements of the Third Crusade, which are not substantial, considering that those knights are then split themselves between the supporters of Conrad of Montferrat in Tyre and Guy himself, and indeed split around the coast into Tripoli and things like that. So where does Guy get all these knights from if they hadn't survived the Battle of Hattin itself? And we see the collapse of the kingdom. All these cities just start surrendering. Saladin's army turns up. They might hold out for a few days or a week or a couple of weeks in the case of Jerusalem. But then they surrender, and then the people are allowed to move to Christian territory or sold into slavery, etc. But there's fortifications like Kerak and Safed and Beaufort and Shorback who hold out for the better part of 2 years or more. And the question is, who's defending those castles? So I think we've got this impression that Hattin is a disaster, and it is an absolute disaster. But that there's a greater survivability, that there's more people, more knights who have made it out of the battle, who have managed to find refuge or safety somewhere, than we might immediately give credit to. And that in itself provides then sort of this kernel, this core for the kingdom thereafter in the Third Crusade to go on and fight. So you've got enough men to be able to maintain some sort of continuity after Hattin and after the Third Crusade. Undoubtedly more continue to die in the years of conflict throughout the Third Crusade, but there's substantially more than we might give it credit for. And that the Hattin is a very bloody victory for Saladin. It's very disaster for the Franks. But several hundred knights might still, may have, made it out quite alive and have not been captured and have not been killed.
That's pretty interesting. So I've often wondered about that myself. I mean, in the wake of this serious victory in which the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is destroyed, we have a couple of things that happen that are sort of important, almost reverses for Saladin, or minor reverses. Tyre, of course, is one thing that happens. Saladin is unable to capture Tyre, and then of course suddenly there's an army that's putting Acre to siege. So that is pretty interesting, and I guess what you're saying is that there were survivors from Hattin, but then also it looks like as these various fortifications are surrendering to Saladin, there's a lot of knights who are going to be able to kind of coalesce around Tyre and these last surviving points.
Yeah, I mean, the sources, I think it's Ibn al-Thir, turns around and says that when Saladin gets to Tyre and these other locations, he finds that they're just full of the defenders who have survived Hattin and in the other cities that he's already attacked and let the populaces go. The thing is, we have a narrative that there is this decline, there is this fall, there is this battle, and it's disastrous, and these kind of numbers, these kind of individual actions, this period in between Hattin and the major arrival of the Third Crusade, doesn't fit that narrative, but it's a very exciting narrative. So it's gains a lot of traction, but I think we've underestimated. I mean, not to underestimate the importance and the disaster that Hattin is, but the survivability and that the role that the Franks themselves can do, the importance that they play before the arrival of Western Crusaders. I mean, there's a point when the Sicilian Crusaders who arrive in 1188 arrive at Tyre, where Conrad is. And Conrad, according to the source material, is thinking of going to relieve pressure of the attacks being made on Tripoli by Saladin at that time, which would suggest that if Conrad's able to, is planning such an offensive by himself from Tyre at that point in time, that he's got to have resources and men and troops available to make some sort of meaningful effect to do it. So if he hasn't got the men to do it, so where have those men come from if this is the first major reinforcements that have arrived from the Latin West from Sicily, if they hadn't already always been there?
Yeah, that's very interesting. We have this major defeat at Hattin, and you do kind of wonder what resources were available. Do we have any idea about the numbers, about what kind of army they were able to field at this point? Or
the numbers that they give for like Guy's march on to Acre is 600, 700 men, which is the equivalent of the secular resources of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its height anyway. And we know that in the period up until his march, the only two key contingents that had arrived in the Latin East to provide any meaningful assistance were the troops sent by the King of Sicily, William II of Sicily, who arrived, and they've got he sends 500 men all in all, 500 knights all in all, and Guy's own brother Geoffrey de Lusignan, who arrives with a party of unknown size from the Latin West, and he assists him as well. But considering that this party, these knights are going to be split between those supporting Conrad of Montferrat amongst the baronage, these Sicilian knights are sent to Tripoli to help defend Tripoli, so they're going to remain in Tripoli and things like that. Where does Guy get the 600, 700 knights from, if not from survivors of the battle? And we know the names of these individuals. We know the Balian people and survivors, Reynald of Sidon even, Pagan of Haifa, the Viscount of Nazareth, many others that appear in the source material, either in the Chronicles or indeed the charters, signing their names, witnessing charters that occur in this 1187 to 1189 period. Where do they come from? And then this 600 or 700 men, if he's got to have these troops from somewhere, so they've got to have come from the survivors of the battle. And we know that some survivors made it out because they're named as, having fled the battle. And escaped. I mean, Raymond III of Tripoli and a handful of knights managed to escape, and they were in the vanguard of the army. We, I think, have overestimated the scale of the defeat. I mean, Hattin is a terrible defeat. It destroys the army. It removes an active field army, so the Franks don't have an effective fighting force to be able to go and relieve any particular sieges in any particular instance. So Saladin is able to capture all of these cities. But there are still enough pockets of resistance that eventually coalesce in the coast into Tyre and Tripoli that are capable of forming a coherent force which Guy and Conrad can use to then go and attack Acre. So we've got the idea that Hattin is a terrible disaster, but we must temper that kind of idea with that how many people escape. The military orders are executed after the battle, which removes a good half of the military force available to the Franks. But how many escape? And I think it's probably more than we might initially give credit for. Ibn al-Athir gives a figure in his work of 150 knights are captured with Guy de Lusignan when his standard falls. I mean, if we just take that at face value, for example, well, 150 knights, that still leaves 450 knights from secular sources that need to be accounted for. And similarly, some are going to be killed in the Battle of Hattin, but what about the rest?
Right. So after the Third Crusade departs, while the Third Crusade is present, obviously Outremer has the advantage of these armies from England and France supporting their defense of the coastline. But once Third Crusade leaves, Richard the Lionheart leaves, the French army leaves, the English army leave. At that point, Crusader Outremer is once again left to its own resources, its own military establishment. So what was available to them? They obviously did recover to some extent. What were the military resources like in post-1192 Outremer and into the 13th century?
I think one of the problems that we face with, and why this topic doesn't get looked at very much, is because after the departure of the Third Crusade, which and returns to the Latin West, there is an explosion of crusading activity in the following decades between 1187 and 1254, between the Third and Seventh Crusades. Explosion of activity, the height of crusading. And the problem is that the majority of this is taken as from the initiative from the Latin West, rather than affairs in the Latin East. The Second Crusade and the Third Crusade are sparked by events in the Latin East, the fall of Edessa, the fall of Jerusalem. But the German Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, the Sixth Crusade, the Seventh Crusade take their impetus much more from the affairs of Latin West. And as a result, we've kind of ignored the impact of the Latin East and the ability of the Latin East in between this period, because the narrative moves away from the Latin East onto the affairs of the Latin West. So, you think of the Seventh Crusade, and every history you read of the Seventh Crusade is all about Louis IX.
Right.
And nothing really happens of interest in the Latin East until you get to Cyprus. So I think this has kind of overshadowed what's been going on. And it's overshadowed the fact that the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Latin East, actually recovers much more rapidly than we might necessarily give it credit for. These crusades aren't necessarily coming to the rescue of the Latin East, though certainly they're coming to assist the very poor position that it finds itself in post-1187, post-1192. But the kingdom is much more better off than we might initially think it is. But because it has been massively diminished in size, we automatically assume that it's also massively diminished in ability, which is incorrect. Looking at the numbers and from chronicles and charters and other source material of the numbers of troops mentioned, and of course we must always be a bit cautious with medieval numbers, but by the early 13th century, within the first decade of the 13th century, I suspect that the kingdom has recovered substantial amounts of men and material, certainly to the order of several hundred knights.
So are the resources at this point comparable to, the pre-1187 kingdom?
Not quite yet. I mean, if we take, say, in 1211, John de Brienne, king of Jerusalem, sends 50 knights to go to fight in Armenia, which is assuming that, it's a substantial amount, considering that the kingdom has been dramatically reduced. If you take all of the cities and all the lordships, which are still nominally under Christian control post 1192, and compare it to the list that John of Jaffa, the 13th century legalist, creates for the number of knights that each of the lordships of the kingdom owed in service in the late 12th century, you get to a figure of 300 to 400 in this period up until the Fifth Crusade. So assuming these cities are capable of still producing the same quotas, which obviously is debatable, 50 knights out of 400 is a substantial proportion that he's willing to risk. By the time you get to the Fifth Crusade, the chronicles speak of 300 knights, Frankish knights, 400 Frankish knights, 120 knights are left to defend the Caemont region and Caesarea and things like that. John de Brienne takes 300 knights with him but leaves 500 behind, all of these sort of things. In addition to speaking of the 1,000 knights or the 2,000 knights, or referencing other crusaders from the kings of Hungary or from Cyprus and other things like that. So that by the time of the Fifth Crusade in the 1220s, those numbers suggest that we're in the order of several hundred. So we must be around the 400 mark. And by the time we get to the 1240s, at the Battle of La Forbie in 1244, the chronicles and indeed the letters from the Patriarch of Jerusalem listing the number of people who've died suggest that there are 600 secular knights and there's approximately 600 knights from the military orders, which means the army would be, at least in terms of knights, comparable to 1187. Infantry is a question of debate, but again, there must be a substantial amount of infantry. And what I suspect what has happened is that while the kingdom is massively reduced in size, its resources that are available to be able to sustain knights have not been reduced. What's actually happened is the kingdom no longer relies upon landed resources to produce landed fiefs to sustain knights, but because it maintains control of cities along the coast, these cities are incredibly wealthy, incredibly cash rich, and the ability to offset the losses of land and the number of knights lost therefrom by using cash fiefs to pay for them, I think allows them to maintain a comparable number of knights that they're able to recover over the course of the early 13th century relatively quickly. To give an example, in 1229, Frederick II is the king of the Jerusalem, makes a donation, an annual donation of 6,400 bezants to the Teutonic Knights. And the year before that, the Prince of Antioch had already given 1,000 bezants. So you've got 7,400 bezants are being given from the tolls of the custom house from the chain of Acre and the port of Acre, so from Crown resources and from the Prince of Antioch's resources, which is the equivalent of sustaining, on average, somewhere between 14 to 24 knights, which puts them at the same level as a lordship like Caesarea or Beirut. And that's assuming that the Crown and the Prince of Antioch can afford to absorb that loss through a donation, that they're financially able to do that. So assuming the Crown resources and the resources of other lords must be sufficiently greater to be able to pay for them. So you have rich lords of these cities, the lords of like the Ibelins, for example, who control Beirut, who are becoming extremely wealthy because they control these ports and these cities, and we see a massive increase in the role of the Italian mercantile cities, the sheer number of contracts and quarters that they open up, so that these powerful lords who now control these cities can act as great patrons to knights who are now landless, and create client knights that they're able to support financially. That's disproportionate to the amount of land they have. If you go back to John of Jaffa, writing in the later 13th century, he says that he considers, amongst others, the Count of Jaffa and the Lord of Sidon to be amongst the leading barons of the kingdom, because they can produce 100. They have the service of 100 knights. But in 1187, according to the lists, they owed a lot less than 100 knights, less than 50 in some cases. So there has to have been a redistribution of knights to those cities, or at least John is projecting the idea that they have access to those kind of levels of resources. So I think we underestimated the sheer wealth of the kingdom and its ability through that wealth to offset its losses from land and its number of knights that it can pay to do that. And if we just think of, say, the cities of northern Italy, like Venice and Florence and things like that, or the Low Countries in Belgium and the Netherlands, and the sheer amount of troops that they're able to produce, that we have a comparable situation to those kind of areas.
Yeah. So I know, even during the pre-1187 kingdom, a lot of the wealth of the kingdom was concentrated in these coastal cities. Would we say that these cities like, a city like Accra or Tripoli kind of become even wealthier during the 13th century? Because I think in general, the 13th century is a period when economic activity in general increases over the 12th century.
Yeah, massively so. But it's strange that the narrative then doesn't change, that if we acknowledge that these cities are becoming increasingly wealthy, and they certainly display it, the amount of refortification, their size increases, the number of churches that are simply present in the city, and you can't have churches unless you have people to build them and people to sustain them, increases massively. But at the same time, that hasn't changed the narrative of that. Why do we assume that the kingdom is, on the back foot, if it's as wealthy as we suggest it is? That we haven't made that jump for some reason between one and the other, because the sources seem to indicate that it is. What I think is happening is that we're looking at ideas of service and things like that, and we have a lot of people knights who exist that don't exist on paper. They don't appear there. They don't sign charters. They don't appear as mentioned in chronicles and things like that. What we actually have is lots of individuals who exist, who are present, but don't leave any paper trail. People who stay in the Latin East, client knights, for example, or who stay there for a temporary period of time, mercenaries, for want of a better description. I mean, in the 1250s, the Prince of Antioch has access to sends 800 Frenchmen to go and fight for him during the War of Saint Sebas, who assumably those 800 Frenchmen, and they're actually called Frenchmen, must have come from people who had stayed after the Seventh Crusade. And indeed, the sheer explosion of crusading sees thousands of people arrive in the Latin East over this period of time. And assumably some of them must have stayed. I mean, we know the names of some being quite famous, obviously, people like Henry II of Champagne, Jean de Brienne, but there's also the names of lots of other identifiable individuals. And so I suspect that we have a lot of people who are paid for, but because they don't leave any immediate presence in the source material, we kind of assume that things have gone bad. And also that because the kingdom doesn't seem to engage in its own unilateral actions, it doesn't take its own unilateral offensive action as much in the early 13th century, that leads us to believe that it can't do it, which I think is incorrect.
Right. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, if this idea that we've been talking about, this sort of persistent myth that the post Third Crusade Outremer was just kind of hanging on by a thread and just waiting to be conquered by the Saracens, it kind of raises the question, well, why did the Saracens wait so long to just take control of that territory? I mean, there must have been some kind of formidable defensive system that existed there in these coastal cities. Otherwise, I mean, surely if it was just that easy, you would have seen the Muslims take control of it a lot sooner. I mean, of course, there's this idea that the Muslims kind of used the Outremer to kind of play off each other. I mean, the Ayyubids and their feuds, were always shifting alliances. But I mean, still, for Latin Outremer to have any kind of ability to survive, with such powerful Muslim states around them, certainly there had to be some sort of formidable military structure in place, and that sounds like that's what you're saying without question.
Yeah, I mean the Muslims, the Ayyubid rulers of Syria, of Damascus, and the other cities of Syria unite and include the Franks in their plans in 1244 to go and attack their rivals, the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt. And this is what leads to the Battle of La Fourby. And the Franks have to be of sufficient caliber because they make up a considerable proportion of the army. We've always seen the traditional view of the battle is seen it as the Franks as a minor role in it being very much an Egyptian versus Syria affair, but it isn't actually. Further research into it by various historians I've shown that the Franks make up a considerable proportion of the army, and that they must have been of sufficient value and caliber. There should have been a sufficient military force available to them to be considered as an inclusive part of the army. I mean, why would you include the Franks in your alliance to go and fight Egypt? And the plan is actually to conquer Egypt, and the Franks are offered a chunk of Egypt in as a reward for their assistance. If they haven't got the resources and the means to be able to contribute to it, you're not going to take on a junior partner and give them such a large reward. You're going to take on someone who's actually got something that meaningfully contributes to it. I think this is because the kingdom's recovered its forces, these of several hundred knights from secular sources. I mean, the military orders recover pretty damn quickly because they're international and they have international resources available to them. I mean, the Templars and the Hospitallers are sending reinforcements to the Latin East 1 year, in the autumn of 1188, and we were very familiar with the role of the Templars and the Hospitallers in the Third Crusade. But then, and so they recover relatively quickly. And of course, we have the growth of the Teutonic Order from 1198 onwards. The Teutonic Knights who, come to a similar kind of size as the two elder orders. So you have the better part of 700, 800 knights just from the military orders alone. In itself. So they recover pretty quickly, but I think we've underestimated how quickly the Franks themselves recover back up to that 400, 500, 600, if not, in fact, maybe more, in those decades after Hattin, because it doesn't fit this kind of imperiled kingdom narrative that we've traditionally assumed, and because our focus has been drawn away from Palestine to the affairs of the Latin West and the actions of, and albeit very influential individuals like Frederick II and Louis IX.
Right, yeah. So we've kind of started to touch on the issue of the Muslim neighbors that Crusader Outremer was now dealing with. When Saladin dies in 1193, and really even before that, his empire was beginning to fracture, and it did fall into this state of rather chronic civil war among his heirs. The Ayyubids seem to be constantly jockeying against each other. I mean, we've mentioned Ibn al-Athir. When you read his chronicle from that period, that seems to be the dominant theme, is these various conflicts among the Ayyubids. So, Dr. Donnachie, could you speak to us about what the Muslims' world in Syria and Egypt was like at this time? What sort of opposition were they to Crusader Outremer? What were their military resources in comparison to Outremer?
Saladin's death in 1193 in some ways is an absolute gift to the Franks, because towards the end of his life, his control over his fairly large empire was starting to fall apart. It was a confederation, and it was starting to crumble. It was starting to fracture, and his death removes any binding agent for that empire, and it fractures between his sons, his nephews, his brother, and they all squabble and fight. And it's not until 1201 that his brother Aladil sort of exerts enough hegemony over the region and takes control. So you have a good, almost 10 years for the Franks to recover, for the Franks to sort themselves out, and that's essential to them. If Saladin had lived, and if after the 3 years of the truce he continued to push for the war, then it would have been a very bleak situation for the Franks. But he doesn't. He dies, and the Franks are given this window of opportunity to attempt to recover, and they make use of it. But the problem is that Aladil is in charge, and I find this actually, there's kind of a comparison here between Saladin and Aladil and Guy de Lusignan and Aimu de Lusignan, who's ruling at the same time, in that they're both brothers of slightly more famous, the junior part of the slightly more famous brothers. But whereas their brothers have died, they have been borne witness to all of the things that have happened and ultimately have learned all the lessons. Aladil, much like Aimu de Lusignan, knows that if it comes to war, there's going to be another crusade. And he knows that if he wipes out the remainder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader States, there will be yet another crusade from the Latin West, and he's going to have to go through the entire problem that Saladin went through, and he's not having any of that. Because he's seen what has happened, and he knows it's not a wise thing to do. And Aimu likewise knows that he can't push the Muslims too far either by being too bellicose, because, well, he's seen what happens with Guy.
So they're two kind of very practical figures, is what you seem to be saying.
They've learnt, from what their brothers did, and neither of them has, I think, a great desire to push it any further than needs be, and just get on with bigger important issues. Aimu has bigger important issues over Cyprus and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Aladil has bigger important issues with Ayyubid dominance and control and the rebuilding of the Ayyubid Empire in Syria. And the Franks aren't a major issue for him; they're just an annoyance. They can be left alone. But because the empire has fractured amongst the squabbling heirs, it's no longer as big and powerful as it once was. It's been estimated that the number of the sort of cavalry element that the Ayyubids could produce in the early 13th century is somewhere in the order of about 23,000 cavalry. Mm-hmm. But Saladin's armies, they was producing at Hattin, with all of his forces drawn together from across the Confederation, have been estimated between 30 and 40,000. So wow. The Franks have. Yeah, so there's a substantial drop. I mean, obviously you take a pinch of salt with these numbers because they're obviously estimations, but there's a substantial drop. And the thing is that Damascus doesn't like Cairo. Cairo doesn't like Damascus. Neither Damascus or Cairo like Aleppo, and so on and so forth between all of these rulers. So that the Franks, it's kind of gone back to a situation much like in the early and middle 12th century, when different rulers of different cities all have their personal rivalries with each other. And so the Franks can attack or push in any particular direction, and as long as it's not too far, they're only going to rouse the ire of only one particular lord. It's only if a crusade turns up, which is an external threat, which is a jeopardy to all of the Ayyubids, that they can put their pettinesses aside and actually unite and deal with the issue. So the Franks don't actually necessarily have to fight the entire combined weight of this Ayyubid Goliath like they had to do with Saladin, but rather individual parts which are much more easily dealt with, or present a lesser enemy to overcome.
Right. Yeah, I guess we could say that crusade and jihad are these ideals that exist in both of these civilizations, and yet in the day-to-day affairs of just dealing with politics and government, I mean, these things often just don't come up.
Well, pragmatism usually wins out in the end.
Yeah, I mean, there's incredible internal issues going on both in Outremer and for the Ayyubids. It seems like there's more conflict within Outremer itself in many ways, and within the Ayyubid territories than there are against each other.
Indeed, and we wonder if they're happy enough to engage in civil conflicts with each other, are they particularly concerned about the external threat? I mean, if the situation is so perilous, indeed to either of them, why are they so happy to to waste their time, as it were, waste their energy and resources on internal conflicts rather than external ones, if they aren't secure enough and able enough to do it in the first place?
Yeah, that has always struck me, actually. I mean, especially when we look at the Sixth Crusade, which seems to be so mired in conflict among the various Frankish factions. I mean, it doesn't seem like a territory or an elite that is in fear of its very existence.
Mm.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the Ayyubids and the state of the Muslim world at this time, or at least the local Muslim world, in contact with Outremer. So yeah, this issue of the geographic changes of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. How does that affect the military model for Crusader Outremer? I mean, of course, now we've got Cyprus as part of the mix, and you mentioned in your notes the fact that Armenia is becoming this important player locally, and then also the Byzantine Empire is kind of removed almost as it is removed because it becomes a part of the Latin West briefly. So yeah, what would you say to that, Dr. Donnachie?
The geographic element is absolutely integral. I mean, the Latin East, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states had always been very much a frontier sort of society, on the frontier of Christianity and the frontier of Christendom, and therefore had lots of elements and traits that that are frequently associated with frontier societies by frontier historians. But the thing is, after 1192, once the Treaty of Jaffa has been made, that frontier is very much closer to the cities and the centres of Frankish civilization than it ever was before. There's no room for defence in depth anymore because the kingdom is 90 miles long, or about thereabouts, and only a few miles wide at its greatest. The frontier, you can see the frontier now, whereas before maybe it was beyond those mountains, over that river or something like that, out in the desert, just kind of faded away. Now it's very much closer. And this has an inevitable effect on the kind of outlook and ideas of the kingdom, especially with the conquest of Cyprus. Because Cyprus is a relatively safe offshore bastion of the Crusader States. The Ottoman navy has been worn down and is not much of a threat anymore. Christian shipping under the various Italian cities is growing considerably and is dominating the Eastern Mediterranean. There are still pirates, there are still raids, but there's no major naval threat, and as a result, Cyprus is comparatively a safe place for them. And so we don't have a defence in depth on the main Syrian and Levantine coast anymore. The defence in depth has now been kind of projected the other way towards Cyprus. Cyprus is now the defence in depth. It is a bastion. It is a refuge. And as such, the focus of the kingdom is no longer kind of orientated towards Syria and Egypt and looking out to conquer and capture areas and push forward its boundaries. It's actually just much more orientated around the coast and securing what it's got and building up maritime ties with other areas. I mean, these cities are the lifeline to the Latin West, on which the ships which bring crusaders and money and supplies and reinforcements, etc., are going to flow. And in the event of any attack, are going to be the beachheads by which as indeed Acre and Tyre and Tripoli were, the beachheads through which the reinforcements will appear. And this dominates the idea and attitudes of the Crusade of the Franks in the kingdom after 1192. These cities can be held; they can be reinforced by sea from other cities. I mean, if you just think of the sheer bother of the Third Crusade on how long it takes. I mean, Tyre holds out on two separate sieges. The siege of Acre lasts 2 years because it gets resupplied periodically. Jaffa is relieved, quite spectacularly by Richard the Lionheart, and then again in 1197 it's evacuated, it's defended and evacuated, and again in 1218 Caesarea is defended and evacuated by the sea. These cities along the coast are able to overlap and support each other through naval elements, and therefore in the event of the city falling, you have time to either resupply it, reinforce it, because you control the seas, or evacuate it and therefore minimize the loss of said city. Whereas if you go inland, you can't do that with Jerusalem. You can't do that with cities further inland. That's not as readily an option or available to you. Yeah. So the Franks focus along the coast, and the coast becomes the center of their world because it connects them to the safety of Cyprus, it connects them to the safety of the Latin West, and it indeed connects them to Armenia.
Yeah. So I think we've kind of already started to get at this, but Hattin as a major military disaster, obviously it was a huge catastrophe, although it wasn't the existential disaster that it's sometimes looked at to be. You've sort of alluded to the fact that it taught Crusader Outremer certain lessons, like the military paradigm kind of changes in Outremer following Hattin and the Third Crusade. There's a different approach now, and we've started to allude to that. How would you define the change in that approach?
It's always been the case that I've since I ever started looking at this sort of topic, when I was doing my PhD, is that Hattin and the subsequent conquest and virtual annihilation of the kingdom and the Latin East in general is such a huge calamity and disaster that surely it must have some impact upon the society that survives it. You can't undergo such a catastrophe without being changed by it somehow. And I've always postulated how much of a difference is there between a post-Hattin kingdom to what existed before it. Is the kingdom and indeed the Latin East fundamentally changed by this? And in regards to its military, I think that it is. And to be in the briefest possible form, I'd say once bitten, twice shy is a sort of sums it up. The Franks have this battle. They have Hattin. It's a disaster. The story is well known, and the kingdom is virtually annihilated. And in the post-Third Crusade kingdom, after 1192, the Franks don't, by themselves, engage in any major clash of arms against their Muslim neighbours. Significant clash of arms. Mm-hmm. It's only with the arrival of Crusades or substantial reinforcements from the Latin West, when those numbers and extra resources and men make it a greater likelihood of success, that they engage in any seriously offensive actions with the intentions of capturing or expanding the kingdom. So in 1197, we see 1198 we have the German Crusade, and we see the capture of Beirut and Sidon, and the attack and the siege of the fortress of Toron, which threatens communications between Acre and Tyre. In 1203, we have the portions of the Fourth Crusade arrive from the Latin East. Aimé de Lusignan as the king. It goes on major raids. He has some naval raids against the coast of Egypt. But as soon as the Fourth Crusade is peters out and they realize no one's coming from Constantinople, they quickly tie everything up. John de Brienne turns up in 1210 with some 300-odd knights, and again, there's some major heavy raiding around, particularly in the Galilee, and there's another naval raid on the coast of Egypt. The Fifth Crusade turns up, and there are some major conquests again. They attack Egypt, obviously. There's heavy raiding and sieges in Palestine. But that fails. And then when the Sixth Crusade turns up, of course, we have the return of Jerusalem itself through negotiation. And then the Barons' Crusade turns up in the late 1230s, so 1240s, and we have the return of Ascalon and the Galilee. And these are the only times that these sort of returns of territory are conducted. There's no equivalent of like the early 12th century when the Franks would be incredibly aggressive, despite having similar resources available to them, if not slightly better in the early 13th century, because they've got 3 fully formed military orders, which the Franks of the early 12th century never had. By comparison, I mean, you think of the early 12th century between 1099 and, say, 1030, there's the Palestinian coast is captured, there's attacks on Aleppo and Damascus, and things like that. That doesn't happen in the same 30-year period after 1192. Because I think the Franks have learned that battles are incredibly dangerous things and incredibly risky, and that the kingdom, their existence, the civilization cannot be jeopardized on battles, when a slower, steady, more cautious approach can be just as successful. And it is for them. Their kingdom does expand and grow over the next between 1187 and 1244. It does work. That ultimately that gambling on battles is a dangerous thing. So what they choose to do is actually focus on raiding. And raiding has often been seen as sort of like a resort of last resort for the Franks, particularly in the later 13th century against Mamluks. But raiding is the indicative of a frontier society, and the frontier society after 1192 is on their doorstep. So it's what they're inevitably going to have to do. And they excel at it. They do it consistently. That's it. All the time. So what they do is through raiding they can seek to control an area by subjugating the populace or driving it away, and bringing it under their own control. And this is what they do repeatedly over decades, so that by the time they do it frequently throughout the Galilee for 20, 30 years. So when the Galilee is returned to them in the 1240s, they pretty much already own all of it and have enough control over it. And they've already forced the Obods to destroy or withdraw castles that they had previously built there.
Yeah, Ibn al-Athir mentions quite a few raids, and he doesn't describe it as sort of an insignificant thing. He seems to indicate that these are serious things, from a serious military threat in its own way.
And the sources often give figures of a couple of hundred knights composed of secular sources and the military orders, which is a substantial force. We can assume that there are other raiding activities going on a much smaller scale that are so small by comparison that they're not considered to be particularly noteworthy, but no doubt exist. And the Franks are also projecting areas of control around them, and this is where I think the Kingdom of Acre really comes in, is that their focus is on the hinterlands around Acre and Tyre, the rich fertile areas of the Galilee, but also the route that any army coming from Damascus or northern Syria is going to have to march through the Bekaa Valley, over the Jordan, things like that, to attack the core of the kingdom in Acre and Tyre. So as a result, that's the area they focus on.
Yeah, really fascinating topic. I admit, early when I first began studying the Crusades, that was just the initial impression I got, was that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was sort of hanging on by a thread in the post-Third Crusade world, but that has really changed in my mind, both as a result of talking with you about this, Dr. Donnachie, and different things I've read. So it really does kind of give us a different perspective on the history of the Crusades. We can't look at the 13th century in the same way. It almost seems to me, from our discussion, we can look at the post maybe 50 or so years after the Third Crusade as this period of genuine recovery and kind of almost a resurgence for Outremer. And then what really happens is, Laforby happens in 1244, and the Seventh Crusade is kind of a disaster, like a serious disaster, maybe the worst disaster in the history of the numbered Crusades. And that, that failure, and then the sudden rise of the Mamluks, who are more aggressive in their approach toward jihad, that seems to kind of represent the more serious turning point, and when we can almost look at this as the beginning of a decline. Does that coincide with how you view it, Dr. Donnachie?
Very much so. I mean, the Mamluks, compared to the Ayyubids, are much more aggressive, much more unified, and much more determined to much more warlike, much more determined to remove the Crusaders, remove the remnants of the Crusader States. But the problem is, I think that in studying the 13th century, the later 13th century is awfully exciting in comparison, and a lot of things happen, and that's kind of been projected backwards. The ideas and attitudes that may be perfectly acceptable, perfectly apt for the later 13th century are projected backwards a bit too readily onto the early 13th century. The problem I find is that histories of the Crusades are not always histories of the Latin East, and that inevitably impacts on it, in that the explosion of crusading detracts from the history of the Latin East because they're not people don't as readily connect them as they should do, and seeing what the situation is. So the kingdom recovers, I think, much more rapidly, much more capably, much more ably, than we give it credit for. We could talk for hours on the sheer economics of the situation. But that shouldn't lead us to a narrative, of course, that everything's absolutely fine. The kingdom is in a bad way. The kingdom has lots of challenges and problems ahead of it, and it has to figure out how to overcome them. The kingdom in the early 13th century has problems and is in danger, but it's not the weakened, imperiled, clinging to desperately to existence kind of kingdom that we have often portrayed it as, with Crusades turning up to rescue it. And one thing I looked at was the embassies and envoys, ambassadors sent from the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the Latin West, imploring for help. And if you look at at least the extant letters that we still have, and references to embassies that turn up, or implied embassies, if you take the dates of when they turn up, the vast majority of them who turn up in the Latin West, or letters calling for aid and military assistance, all occur within the context of the preparation or undertaking of an actual crusade. So the exact time that you're going to want to send letters saying we need more men, we need more troops, help, we're imperiled, there's a certain measure of propaganda there. But the years of peace in between these crusades, when there are truces covering the situation and there's and conflict is minimal, see very few letters sent asking for help. Which they do send a few of them, but they're much smaller. But this is the most opportune time you think you would be asking for assistance to build up your resources, to need money and men and material to build castles and things like that. Those don't exist as readily. They're significantly fewer. I mean, that could just be the nature of the survivability, the surviving material, or it could be that the Franks aren't sending them because they don't really need as much help as we think they do, and they're only asking for help in the middle of a military conflict.
That's really fascinating, but it makes perfect sense. And so I guess what we see is, as we get into the 1260s, the 1270s, do we tend to see more outcries of help from Outremer to the west?
Yeah, it tends to get worse, as it were. I mean, the 4B happens, and that kind of proves the why they shouldn't have fought in battles, and after Hattin, as they did, things have been working pretty fine. By the 1240s, the kingdom has grown substantially once again and is approaching similar kind of sizes to what it once was before, and there was the prospect of yet more of a further continuation had the 4B been successful. But they decide to have a battle, they're defeated, lots of people are killed once again. It's comparable to Hattin in some ways. And in the following years, the kingdom is once again loses a considerable amount of territory, and another crusade is called. I was going to show us why that's why you stopped. You hadn't been fighting battles for 30 or 40 years. But that they felt able to fight a battle again must imply that they're able and have resources available to do it.
A little more confidence. Perhaps there should have been an attitude of, let's just let the Muslims fight this one out. We'll watch. Yeah. This is really interesting stuff, Dr. Donnachie. Before we go, I just want to have one little addendum here. The Sixth Crusade is pretty interesting, because Jerusalem in some way is once again made a part of the Christian world. What do you make of that? I know there's kind of a couple of different attitudes we get from historians. Some say, oh, well, this was just kind of a, symbolic thing and, didn't really amount to much. And then I do know that, David Abulafia, who wrote this really interesting biography of Frederick II, he really insists that it was very significant and that, in fact, the fortifications were restored and there was a lot of building going on in the 1230s when they controlled Jerusalem again. What do you say to that, Dr. Donnachie? What do you think about this return of Jerusalem?
There's no denying the sheer political and propaganda coup, as it were, for Frederick II in doing so. The emperor returns, Jerusalem to Christian control. It's brilliant stuff, a PR field day, really, for him. The problem is that the Franks are absolutely gobsmacked with the situation. Is that it's completely unmanageable for them. They cannot be dealing. They turn to, what have you done? Like, this is completely unworkable. It's unfeasible. This is an impractical situation that you've imposed on us, and that's one of the reasons why they get so angry at him, is because he does it by himself without consulting the Franks, who would have advised something completely different. The problem is the Franks haven't wanted to move away from the coast because they know they're safe on the coast, and German Crusaders in 1198 are very critical of them, that this reluctance to move away from the coast, and they make some very disparaging remarks about the Franks, and then the Franks complain at Frederick II when he returns Jerusalem to them, which is obviously the goal of Crusaders. But the Franks are not happy about this. And even in the 1250s, when Louis IX is present, he wants to go off to try and secure the route towards Jerusalem and things like that. And the Franks go, no, can you just focus on the coast for us, because that's what they want. And there are refortifications made at Jerusalem. There are some defenses that are built. But in comparison to the amount of fortification work that had been going on in places like Acre and Tyre in the Galilee, which becomes very heavily fortified by comparison, not in the sense that there's an actual thought-out, planned defensive structure, but they just increase the sheer number of castles there over the period of time, or they recapture them, or they rebuild them. So you have places like Jidin, Montfort, Safed, Beaufort, for example, Tiberias, Acre, Tyre, the Pilgrim's Castle near Acre and things like that, which exert control and defense and security over that region around the key cities and control Galilee. There is no equivalent use of castles to project influence towards Jerusalem or protect Jerusalem in the period of time that it's under Christian control between 1229 and 1244. They don't fortify the southern part of the kingdom to protect Jerusalem in the same way as they do to defend their northern territories in the Galilee, because it's unworkable for them. It's unmanageable for them. They don't have necessarily the inclination to do it, because they also know that if they don't have places like Kerak and Shorbak beyond the Jordan, that any army from or indeed at places like Ascalon and Gaza and down to the south, that any army from Egypt or indeed from Syria can just march straight up to Jerusalem and attack it with impunity. There's nothing to stop them doing that, because it's beyond their particular paradigm, their coastal paradigm, that's not their defensive model anymore. So while some effort is made to defend it because they're going to have to, because fortifications are needed, it doesn't command the same attention as it does in the north. And I think the Franks while they acknowledge it, no institution returns its headquarters to Jerusalem despite being Christian.
Right.
Yeah. Everyone's set up shop on the coast. Jerusalem's returned, and they go, brilliant, but they don't move.
Yeah.
I think that's very telling. Is that they go, that's not where we are. We're not moving back to Jerusalem. We're staying here because it's much more sensible.
Acre remains the capital throughout that period, doesn't it? Who actually is controlling Jerusalem? Is the kingdom of Acre, or as it will, in control of it? I think there are some sources that seem to kind of allude to this idea that Frederick's agents remained in control of Jerusalem, and it was never really incorporated into the kingdom proper at all.
The problem is, as soon as Frederick's departed, you get a civil war break out. So he's put his men in charge in Jerusalem and everything once it's been returned to them. And a civil war happens, and Frederick loses. But Jerusalem doesn't feature in the civil war. The civil war is based on in Cyprus and on the coast between Acre and Tyre. Mm-hmm. Those are the battlefields. That is the focus of the area of the civil war. Jerusalem is just sitting there, just not doing anything. People going to it and pilgrims and things like that. But it's part of the kingdom, but it's not an integral part. It's just this appendage. Which, when you consider obviously that it's the kingdom of Jerusalem, the focus of crusading, you'd find it odd that that nobody wants to try and incorporate it further. But that's because it's not part of their new military model.
Yeah, it really shows. I mean, how much things have changed. I mean, we've gone from really two different kingdoms from pre 1187 to post 1187. So, well, Dr. Donnachie, this has been really fascinating. I think we've covered quite a bit here, and I really appreciate you speaking with me about this today. And look forward to having you on again some other time for another podcast. So, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So this is Real Crusades History. We release a new podcast on the history of the Crusades every first of the month. You can find us on realcrusadeshistory.com. So thanks for listening. My new book, Why Does the Heathen Rage?, a novel of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, is now available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. Please click on the link in the About box of this video to get your copy. Also, if you would like to support Real Crusades History by offering a donation, you will find a PayPal donate link in the About box of this video. Thank you.